Okay. Okay, so good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, wherever you are. It's a real pleasure to be here today to give my own contribution to the Herodotus helpline. And before starting, I would like to thank Tom Harrison, Jan Haywood, and all of you, not only for being here tonight, but especially for creating such a wonderfully stimulating and inclusive intellectual environment from which personally I have learned so much over the past year. Thank you. Let me also warn you that what I will be sharing with you tonight is still very much a work in progress, and I still have more questions than answers. So I do look forward to hearing your suggestions and thoughts at the end of my presentation. Okay, so I would like to start by sharing with you a quote by Virginia Woolf, which I happened to come across a couple of weeks ago. The quote comes from the very first few pages of A Room of One's Own, where Woolf explains to her readers the reasons behind her choice to write a fictionalized essay rather than a non-fictional one to express her thoughts and ideas about the topic in question. The quote goes like this. At any rate, when a subject is controversial, one cannot hope to tell the truth. One can only show how one came to hold whatever opinion one does hold. One can only give one's audience the chance of drawing their own conclusions as they observe the limitations, the prejudices, the idiosyncrasies of the speaker. Fiction here is likely to contain more truth than facts. So I don't expect us to find in Virginia Woolf's words necessarily a key to understanding Herodotus. But the reason why I'm quoting her today is not just because I find it hilarious that whenever you start reading and learning and thinking about Herodotus, all of a sudden you start seeing and recognizing him literally everywhere you look, nor I'm just quoting her because it's a beautiful quote in its own, but also because I find this quote very well suited to open a talk on Herodotus in that it brings our attention to one question which in many ways has been central to the study of the histories, namely that of the relationship between fact, fiction, truth, and narrative in Herodotus' work. The question has been a particularly crucial one for the historians of the ancient world. What exactly were they supposed to do with a work such as Herodotus one, based on an extensive activity of historia, of inquiry into the past, and so rich in information about the ancient Mediterranean world, and yet teeming with folktale motifs, portents, and miraculous stories, and other hardly believable tales? How were they to distinguish between what was historically accurate and grounded and what not, between what had been made up by Herodotus and his sources and what was reflective of historical facts instead? Huge steps forward have been made with regard to these questions over the past century, thanks to a number of scholarly contributions, which have led, on the one hand, to a more sophisticated understanding of Herodotus' embeddedness in the culture and society of his times, and on the other hand, to a fuller appreciation of the nature of the oral and semi-oral traditions on which Herodotus' work is predominantly based. With regard to this last aspect in particular, it has been stressed how Greek oral and semi-oral traditions were not employed by Herodotus as repositories of information, that is, as rough source material from which to pick here and there isolated details and information as needed, but rather they were used as stories with fully developed narrative structures and encoded meanings, which had been quickly adapted and articulated according to patterns and motifs typical of international folklore, Greek myths, and rites. Great stress has also been placed on the social dimension of oral traditions and on the relationship which exists between oral traditions and the operating mechanisms of group memory as a social phenomenon. Based on comparative evidence, it has been proved how shared memories of the past transmitted in oral form far from being deposited one and for all, are subject to a constant but never accomplished nor coherent process of adaptation to the ever-changing identitary needs, interests, and values of the transmitting group. In light of this, it has been suggested that historicity should not be taken to mean pure factuality when we talk about Herodotus, and that much can be learned about the social history of archaic and classical Greece, as well as about the traditional modes of transmission of past knowledge of that specific sociocultural context from the narrative configuration of even the most hardly believable stories reported by Herodotus. One issue that still remains in need of further investigation, however, is that of the relationship between the pre-existing narrative configuration of the stories which Herodotus embedded in his work and Herodotus' creative process in structuring his narrative. To put it in rather schematic terms, where does the one end and the other begin? And to which extent can we hope to discern one from the other? After all, Herodotus is very careful not to let his reader understand the role that he played in structuring the narrative, and it has been convincingly argued that the meta-discourse about his research process should not be interpreted in this sense, nor be taken at face value. It is this question, namely the intricate relationship between Herodotus' historiographical writing and the oral traditional narratives that his work is based upon, that I would like to focus on tonight. In particular, I would like to look at a specific case study, which I believe is, for a variety of reasons, particularly well suited to address this issue, that is, Herodotus' retelling of Cleomenes. The main arguments which I would like to make tonight are the following. First, I would like to argue that the sequence of stories about Cleomenes in the Histories has been organized and structured by Herodotus in such a way as to conform it to his own way of understanding the world and making sense of the historical process and the conditions of human existence. Secondly, I would like to argue that such structuring of the stories about Cleomenes is the outcome of a process of reworking and adaptation of multiple traditional stories, which had been elaborated in different social environments and had already undergone a process of narrative codification before being collected and weaved together by Herodotus. Thirdly, I would like to suggest that by putting the narrative of Cleomenes in relationship to the rest of the histories, and at the same time by looking at the social surveys and Sitzimleben of the traditional stories recasted by Herodotus, it is possible to identify a number of discrepancies between the meanings attached to those stories in the narrative context of the histories and the meanings and functions which were most likely assigned to those same traditions in the social context of transmission, and that it is where such discrepancies are the more evident that we have better chances to get a grasp of the role played by Herodotus in structuring the narrative of the histories. So let's start from the first point, namely how Herodotus structured the stories of Cleomenes in the histories. As you know, Cleomenes is one of the most prominent, but also most ambivalent characters of the central books of the histories, mainly Book 5 and 6. He features in a number of passages where Herodotus gives an account of the domestic political situations of Greece in the decades leading up to the Persian Wars. And there are then also a number of minor references in other books, but tonight we're going to focus mainly on the main chunks of narrative, which are located in books 5 and 6. One of the first things that can be noticed is the fact that the story of the Spartan king must be pieced together from a number of discontinuous narrative units. So to speak, there is no logos of Cleomenes, strictly speaking, in the histories. Yet, if read in sequence, these episodes appear to be organized according to one of the most productive and recurrent narrative patterns of the histories, that of the rise and fall of the ruler. Typical of Oriental kings and prominent Greek leaders, the pattern follows a bipartite structure. At first, the narrative focuses on the origins of the ruler, which is told in a more or less detailed way, and usually this first sequence includes a brief account of the ruler's rise to power. At the culmination of the ruler's fortunes, then, we often find a warning which anticipates and at the same time emphasizes the transition to the second sequence of the pattern, that of the decline and or annihilation of the ruler's power. The stories featuring Cleomenes follow a similar arrangement. When Herodotus first mentioned the Spartan king in Book 5, it is in the context of the visit of Aristagoras of Miletus to Sparta to seek military support for the Ionian revolt. Before telling of the encounter between Aristagoras and the Spartan king, however, Herodotus suspends the flow of the main narrative so as to tell the story of Cleomenes' birth and ascent to the throne. So the story of Cleomenes' birth represents the first unit in the sequence of stories about Cleomenes that we get in books 5 and 6. When the main narrative resumes, we are told of the virtuous resistance of the Spartan king to the attempts of corruption by Aristagoras of Miletus, who then leaves Sparta and goes to Athens. And it is here, a few chapters later, that we find Cleomenes once again, engaged in multiple and variably successful Spartan military interventions in Athens. It is during one of these campaigns that a disagreement between the two Spartan kings, Cleomenes and Demaratus, emerges for the first time. Further episodes of sabotage of Cleomenes' political line by Demaratus convince Cleomenes of the need to get rid of his colleague. He thus goes to the Pythia of Delphi and persuades her to confirm the rumors about the legitimacy of Demaratus' birth, and by so doing, he manages to remove his political opponent from the Spartan throne. As suggested by the same Herodotus in a notarial comment at the end of the story, the deposition of Demaratus corresponds to the turning point of the narrative and marks the beginning of the second sequence of the pattern, that of the fall of the ruler. At this point, the Spartans are warned by the humiliated Demaratus that the offense he had received would have been either cause of immense joy or of immense despair for the Lacedaemonians. Soon after this warning, everything starts to fall apart for Cleomenes, and the abrupt character of the fall is accentuated by the acceleration of the narrative tempo in this last part of the narrative. Seized by fear of his fellow citizens, who in the meantime had learned of his plots against Demaratus and of the corruption of the Pythia, the king flees from Sparta, and doing something new and radical, says Herodotus, he raises an army in Arcadia to reconquer his city. But the Lacedaemonians, having become afraid of him, decide to call him back as their king. Cleomenes, however, once back to Sparta, falls prey to madness, starts beating his fellow citizens, and is put in the stocks by his own relatives, until one day he gets hold of a knife, and with that he kills himself in the brutal way described at length and with a number of gruesome details by Herodotus. In the chapters that follow the death of the king, Herodotus then speculates on the causes of Cleomenes' madness, reporting different possible explanations circulating among the Greeks, adding in this context one last account starring the Spartan king, that of the Battle of Sepeia. So I believe that the alignment of the narration to the pattern of the rise and fall of the ruler is rather evident. And I hope that this very schematic representation on the slide helps to visualize it. And what I find to be particularly remarkable about it is, first of all, the fact that the pattern of the rise and fall of the ruler, as noted by the same Imervar is highly consistent with one of the central ideas of Herodotus' way of understanding the world, namely that human existence is a kuklos, nothing is permanent, everything is mutable, and what was once great is now small and vice versa, and human beings are subject to the sudden reversal of fortune. Secondly, I find it astonishing that there are a number of clues in the narrative which hint to the fact that this pattern has been imprinted on the structure of the stories about Cleomenes by Herodotus. So there was no logos that followed the pattern of the rise and fall of the ruler before the histories. The first clue of that lies in the fact that, despite the strongly ambivalent character of the king, positive remarks about Cleomenes are to be found exclusively in correspondence to the rising sequence of the pattern. Herodotus, moreover, seems to have arranged the narrative materials about Cleomenes in such a way as to minimize the presence of controversial deeds in this first sequence of the pattern. So, for instance, the impiety, which is inherent in Cleomenes' violation of a temple on the Athenian Acropolis, is downplayed by the valorization of a seemingly Spartan joke. I am no Dorian woman, I'm an Achaean, which partly invalidates the priestess's veto, which would have prevented the Dorians from entering the sacred place. In addition, the episode in which all the most sacrilegious behaviors of the king are concentrated, the Battle of Sepeia, is reported in flashback only after Cleomenes' death. I would like to suggest that both choices seem to be due to Herodotus' will of emphasizing the symbolic value of the dethronement of the Marathus. By minimizing Cleomenes' impiety on the Acropolis and by postponing the narration of the Battle of Sepeia, Herodotus managed to embed in his narrative two stories which could not be omitted, both for their notoriety and relevance to Herodotus' contemporaries and because of their explanatory value for later episodes in the histories. Yet Herodotus managed to embed these stories in such a way as not to undermine the logic that he wanted to imprint on his narrative, which identified the deposition of the Marathus as the turning point of the rise and fall of Cleomenes. In addition, clues of Herodotus' effort to pattern the narrative according to a precise logic can be identified on a thematic level by looking at the way in which the madness of Cleomenes and the degeneration of his rule are articulated in relation to the pattern of the rise and fall of the ruler. It has been noted that the representation of Cleomenes as a mad king features several motifs typical of contemporary representations of madness to be found in 5th century Attic tragedy, medical writings, as well in the myths and ritual practices of the time. Some examples of such motifs are, for instance, the association between madness and impiety, or between madness and violence, or again, between madness and drunkenness, as well as the motive of self-harming as both symptom and consequence of madness, and the motive of the Doppelungsmania, which can be described as the transfiguration of a pre-existing and potentially destructive form of madness into a self-destructive and divinely inspired kind of insanity. Interestingly, these very same motives feature also in of the other main mad king of the histories, Cambyses. The thematic and lexical correspondences in the depiction of the two mad kings, noticed by many, are rather impressive. What is particularly interesting to our purposes is that in both cases, the motive of the duplication of madness is articulated in such a way as to match with the pattern of the rise and fall of the ruler. In both cases, that is, the madness of the king becomes manifest and seemingly divinely inspired only after the episode, which Herodotus tentatively identified as the probable turning point of their reign. Similarly, the representation of Cleomenes' rule not only reproduces a number of motives typically associated with the representation of the tyrant, the subversion of ancestral costumes, the violence and brutality both inflicted and suffered, the ambiguous relationship with religion, and so on. But it is also articulated according to a bipartite structure, which under many respects mirrors the process of deterioration of the power of the monarch described by Johannes in the so-called constitutional debate. The turning point corresponds once again to the dethronement of the Marathus. It seems legitimate then to conclude that while well-rooted in the culture of the time and articulated according to the mental frameworks of the period, the themes of madness and power are given an idiosyncratic expression in the narrative of Cleomenes, as they are articulated in such a way as to follow the overarching logic of the narrative, that of the rise and fall of the ruler, which ultimately is consistent with Herodotus' worldview, understanding of the world. One further clue of Herodotus' original adaptation and recasting of the traditions on Cleomenes is that many details of the traditions about the Spartan king would appear to have been reinterpreted and valorized by Herodotus in such a way as to put Cleomenes' story in dialogue with the Solonian lesson on human happiness. In the famous dialogue between Solon and Croesus, happiness is exemplified at its best by the Athenian Tellus. A free citizen, he lived in a prosperous community, never experienced disgrace or disease, and after having had good children and seen them grow and have children of their own, all of whom survived, he died of a glorious death and was publicly honored by his city. The contrast with Cleomenes is rather stark, to the point that if we look at the conditions of his death, we could perhaps feel entitled to give him the title of Anti-Tellus. Herodotus stresses that the king died leaving no sons behind, which he repeated multiple times, after having ruled for no long time, which is an accuracy, as we know that Cleomenes ruled between the 20 and 30 years. And he also died in complete isolation, unwanted by his community and rejected by his own relatives, prey to mental disease, and what is more, in an exceptionally grim and certainly all but glorious manner. Sure, it could be argued that such representation relies on traditions which had already conformed the depiction of the end of Cleomenes to that of the dying tyrant, and that the Solonian model of happiness is rooted in the contemporary ways of conceptualizing happiness. Yet the precise formulation and the exact antithetical correspondences with the Solonian Tellus leave the impression that Herodotus framed the traditional narratives about the death of Cleomenes according to his own ways of understanding and declining such concepts. So what I have been trying to do so far is to put the narrative of Cleomenes in relation to the rest of the histories in order to identify possible clues of the original reworking and reframing of traditional narratives operated by Herodotus to conform them to his own understanding of the historical process and the conditions of human existence. Let me now move on to the second point, which I would like to make tonight, namely that behind Herodotus' narrative of Cleomenes is not a pre-existing self-contained logos about the Spartan king, but rather multiple traditional stories which had been elaborated in different social environments and which had already undergone a process of narrative codification before being collected and weaved together by Herodotus. We could, for instance, mention the foundational tale of Dorieus, which is reported by Herodotus in connection with the story of Cleomenes' ascent to the throne, and which seems to have been elaborated in multiple stages in interaction with South Italic colonial environments. Or we could refer to the oral and semi-oral oracular stories about the Battle of Sepeia, which preserve traces of the stratified process of elaboration both in Spartan and Argive social context. Or again, we could consider the tyrannical stories about the madness and death of Cleomenes, which must have circulated wildly throughout various Greek environments of the 5th century, taking on multiple forms. In these last few minutes, however, I would like to focus on a type of traditional stories used by Herodotus to retell the story of Cleomenes, which I suspect to have represented a peculiar genre of oral tradition in the Spartan context of transmission, namely royal family traditions. That Herodotus' account, not only of the Spartan king, but of Spartan matters more broadly, partly relied on this peculiar genre of oral traditional stories, is supported by the abundance of highly detailed stories, which were clearly connected with royal environments and reflective of the dynastic interests and tensions which shaped them. Lists of kings and of their duties and privileges, stories centered on the line of succession of the royal Spartan families, tales about the mythical origins of the Spartan diarchy, and on a more superficial level of the superiority of one royal house over the other, all seem to transmit group memories shaped by the type of concerns and interests which we would expect to find only in the specific context of the Spartan diarchy, characterized not only as any royal family by the troubles and vulnerabilities determined by the transmission of power by dynastic succession, but also defined by the peculiar coexistence of two different royal families, as well as by the presence of a number of other institutional organs, the gerousia, the ephorate, the assembly, which place precise limits and constraints on the powers of the diarchs. Well, I hope that we will be able to discuss this question further at the end of my presentation. For now, let's just take one of these royal traditional stories and see in which way the narrative configuration of the story reported by Herodotus bears traces of the meanings encoded in it in the social environments of elaboration and transmission. The story which I picked for you tonight is that of the private encounter between Aristagoras of Miletus and Cleomenes. The episode, as you know, is told in the context of the preparation for the Ionian Revolt, when Aristagoras decides to turn to the Greek mainland in search of military support. One of the elements of this episode, which has puzzled many, is the presence next to Cleomenes of his little daughter Gorgo. As the story goes, when the king dismissed Aristagoras' public request of help, the Milesian went to Cleomenes' house as a suppliant and tried to bribe Cleomenes by promising increasing amount of money. When the sum reached the 50 talents, Gorgo, who had been allowed to stay in the room by her father, warned Cleomenes that the visitor was going to corrupt him unless he got up and left. Pleased with his daughter's advice, says Herodotus, Cleomenes went to another room and Aristagoras left Sparta. So what is Gorgo doing in this scene exactly? And how are we to explain the emphasis which is placed on her presence in Herodotus' account? Is it really a question of showing how the moral rectitude of Cleomenes was already precarious at this point, as suggested by various commentators, Howe and Wells and Hornblower among them? I believe that her presence becomes less puzzling if we read it in connection with the other episodes in which Gorgo is mentioned in the histories. And I didn't report the full Greek passages here, but you can find them in the handout. So Gorgo makes her first appearance in the histories right before the episode of Aristagoras' visit to Sparta, at the end of the account of the unsuccessful colonial expedition of Doriaeus. Here, Herodotus states that if Doriaeus had stayed in Sparta, he would have become king, as Cleomenes didn't reign for long and died without a son, Apais, but only with a daughter whose name was Gorgo. She's then mentioned many pages later in Book 7, when Herodotus gives an account of how Leonidas became king. Since Cleomenes died apace, Leonidas was the natural choice as a successor, as he was the older surviving half-brother and because he had married Cleomenes' daughter, Gorgo. The last passage where Gorgo is mentioned is the story of the Muratus secret message. When Demaratus learned of Circe's decision to march against Greece, he decided to warn the Lacedaemonians by sending them a secret message, which was deciphered only thanks to Gorgo's help, who guessed the tablet's secret by herself. Interestingly, there are a number of elements which occur over and over again in these stories. First, the two stories in which Gorgo plays an active role insist on her cleverness and moral standing, both as a defender of an honest political conduct and as a supporter of the Greek cause against the Persians. In both episodes, moreover, her intervention is vital for the public affairs of Sparta and bears positive outcomes for the city. Finally, in all four passages, she is qualified by her relationship with the men of power closer to her, Cleomenes and Leonidas, but particularly notable is the insistence on her being the only child of Cleomenes. I believe that the insistence of the tradition on these aspects is to be explained in light of the troubles with the succession which followed Cleomenes' death. At first sight, in fact, it would seem that the succession was unproblematic. Out of the three half-brothers of Cleomenes, the older one, Dorieus, had died in Sicily, and the choice had to fall on second half-brother, that is, Leonidas. Herodotus, however, reports an alternative version according to which Leonidas and Cleombrotus would have been twins. The presence of these two alternative versions seems to point to a tension running through the environments which shape these traditions, so that we are left with the impression that there must have been a group interested in questioning the legitimacy of Leonidas' priority over Cleombrotus in the dynastic succession to the throne. The crucial importance of Leonidas' marriage to Gorgo should be apparent at this point. The avuncular marriage was strategic not only to avoid the dispersion of the royal properties among the different branches of the family, but also to reinforce the legitimacy of Leonidas' dynastic line of succession, which must have become a particularly delicate matter during the regency of Cleombrotus and then of his son Pausanias, the charismatic leader of Plataea, famous for his allegedly despotic aspirations and for his tragic ending. Little is known about Leonidas' heir Pleistarchus, but the fact that the throne went to Pausanias' son Pleistonax after his death seems to support the hypothesis of dynastic tensions between the two branches of the family throughout the 5th century. It is perhaps not going too far then to suggest that, as it often happens in similar cases, the Queen Mother Gorgo must have played an important role in ensuring the safety of her child and granting the linearity of the succession. And while it is true that the Spartan political system provided various institutions which were expected to intervene in such situations and safeguard the linearity of succession, as it was the case for Anaxandridas, for instance, at the same time, the transmission of traditions which portrayed Gorgo as a character which brightly and positively intervened in the political affairs of Sparta suggests that it was in the interests of the remembering group to legitimize her direct involvement in the public affairs of Sparta and to value the role she played in the transmission of her father's power, crucial especially when the priority of Leonidas' line of succession over Cleombrotus' one was liable of being questioned. So to go back to the story of the visit of Aristagoras of Miletus to Sparta and of his private meeting with Cleomenes, what must have been a story elaborated in the context of Spartan royal family traditions, meant to value the memory of episodes functional to legitimize the line of succession to the throne, in the hand of Herodotus became a story of anecdotal flavor in a way in which Gorgo's presence was secondary to the main focus of the narrative, the Ionian revolt on the one hand, and the story of the rise and fall of Cleomenes on the other. To conclude, I believe that the way in which the stories of Cleomenes are retold by Herodotus provides a wonderful case study to investigate the relationship between Herodotus' creative role in structuring the continued narrative of the histories and the configuration of the pre-existing traditional stories on which the work is based. What emerges is that Herodotus has remodeled, reorganized, and resemantized a number of oral traditional narratives directly or indirectly connected to the Spartan king, so as to structure the story of Cleomenes in a way that is coherent with his own understanding of the unfolding of the historical process and of the nature of human existence in the world. In the process, however, he didn't radically modify the configuration of the stories so that in many cases, they still offer wonderful opportunities for investigating the configuration of contents and structures of the social memory of the transmitting groups. And this is the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your attention.